continuing this discussion about the Justice Department, turning more toward the FBI in this discussion. And you know, I'm still thinking about this, given all the developments that have happened in recent weeks. But if someone had seriously suggested, even after the November election, that election deniers and conspiracy theorists would be heading the FBI at this moment, I think I would have taken that person immediately to the nearest emergency room for evaluation. But here we are. And Chuck Rosenberg has graciously agreed to join us today. He's uniquely situated to discuss this new era in federal law enforcement and the potential risks and challenges to the institutions as we know them. Chuck has served in key posts across the federal criminal justice system, Chief of Staff to former FBI Director Jim Comey, U.S. Attorney in Alexandria and in Houston, two of the top U.S. Attorney postings in the nation, and Acting Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The list just goes on. His service crosses both Republican and Democratic administrations when nonpartisan leadership was inherent to the work. Please welcome Chuck Rosenberg.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you all for letting me start a few minutes early. I appreciate it. Kevin tells me it's on the record, which is fine. It'll also be far less interesting and entertaining, but that's your call. I'm mostly here to answer questions. As Kevin mentioned, I've spent my life in federal law enforcement. I was appointed to one job by President Bush and another by President Obama. If you put a gun to my head, I couldn't tell you if I was a Republican or a Democrat. I literally have no idea, although I think actually these days I have a pretty good idea. It's getting to be an easier question to answer. I am deeply disturbed by what I am seeing. Like Kevin, I didn't think I would ever see anything quite like this. One thing Kevin omitted, I started my career as a line federal prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney, probably the best job I ever had. And this may sound quaint or even naive, perhaps stupid, but I literally did not know the politics of anyone in my office. It was forbidden to talk about it. It just didn't happen. And I tell people that, and they think, that can't be. How could you be in a place for so many years and not know how the man or woman in the office next to you voted or how she thought? And it just never came up. We sort of prided ourselves on being apolitical and nonpartisan. And whatever views you had outside the office, you never, ever, ever brought in the office. And that also seems broken. And perhaps irretrievably so. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But that was sort of the ethos of the Department of Justice in which I grew up. Like I said, appointed to one job by President Bush, another by President Obama, fired in the first Trump term. Quick story on that, but I was at the time running the DEA, which is sort of weird because as a line prosecutor, I had never done narcotics cases. I had done national security cases, white-collar cases, normal mayhem stuff, but never narcotics. And so toward the end of the Obama administration, I was asked to run the DEA. My view is always when you're asked to do something, if you can say yes, you say yes. I went over there, found it fascinating. Big management challenge for lots of reasons we don't need to get into today, but always happy to talk about some other time. But I loved the work. In Mr. Trump's first term, I think it was in the summer, he gave a speech in Suffolk County, New York, Long Island, to a bunch of cops. And you may remember this, although you were probably not, 8 years ago. Well, what was it, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? Yeah, you're tuned in. Talking about how cops were too nice to people they arrested. They shouldn't protect their heads when they put them in a police car. They should just slam them into the car, which I found absolutely appalling. We have a moral, legal, and ethical obligation to take care of people in our custody, even if we don't approve of what they did, even if they're in our custody, even if we've arrested them for breaking some law. We still have a moral, legal, and ethical obligation to care for them. And so I wrote a letter to my entire workforce saying that, and was out of work very shortly thereafter, which is fine. by the way. I believe you should say what you believe and stand by it, even when there are consequences to it. Like I said, put into one job by President Bush and another by President Obama, then removed during Mr. Trump's first term. I love the Department of Justice. I believe in its mission. I believe deeply in its mission. I had the opportunity to serve twice at the FBI, once, as Kevin mentioned, as Jim Comey's chief of staff, though I left that job to go run the DEA before sort of all the stuff started, before he gave his press conference, before the Clinton email investigation was opened. But much earlier in my career on Bob Mueller's staff, right after 9/11, when he was a new director, and I was his counselor for national security. And that was an inflection point for the FBI. It was a time that the FBI manifestly changed its mission, right? And the national security mission, the counterterrorism mission, the counterintelligence mission became much larger and much more important. It's also a time when, for very good reasons that we should discuss, the FBI centralized a lot of its casework. So the pre-9/11 model at the FBI, remember there was a 1993, well, you won't remember this, but you'll know this. There was a 1993 bombing at the World Trade Center by Al-Qaeda. Familiar, right? 6 people were killed in the sub-basement. Al-Qaeda was behind the plot. The idea was to detonate a bomb in the sub-basement of the World Trade Center and bring down the tower. Didn't work. 6 people are dead. FBI investigated it. But it was run out of the New York field office of the FBI. In the FBI parlance, New York was what they call the office of origin. And that makes a lot of sense when you're working a bank robbery. The Kansas City is the office of origin, or Topeka is the office of origin, but not when you're working an international counterterrorism or national security case. And so one of the things that Mueller did was he centralized the management of these big, sprawling, difficult, multi-jurisdictional, multinational cases at headquarters, something that I think the current leadership of the FBI doesn't quite understand or appreciate and may dismantle, which I think would be to the detriment of the FBI and to our national security. But in any event, got to work for Bob right after 9/11 at the FBI. So 2 tours there, and then a few tours at Main Justice back and forth, although my favorite job, if you asked me, and you wouldn't have to pry the answer out of me, was always as a line at USA, where I just had my agents and my cases, and they left me the hell alone to do the work that I loved. So I miss it every day. I like talking about it. Happy to answer any questions that you have. But first I have a couple of questions for you, just to sort of center the FBI in this discussion. Anyone know here how big it is? How many people work there? Anyone have a guess? Don't be shy. 3,000. Probably 3,000, a little bit on the low end. It's probably about 37, 38,000. Of that, let's for math purposes, but I appreciate that. For math purposes, let's call it 39,000, because then the math works better. Of the 39,000, how many of them are FBI special agents? Oh, men and women with a badge and a gun. Anyone have a guess on that? Please?
5,000. 10. 20.
13. About a third. That's why I picked 39. About 13,000 men and women at the FBI are special agents, badge and a gun. So 1/3 of the FBI special agents, 2/3 are everything else. What's everything else? You have professional support staff, you have intel analysts, you have chemists, you have pilots. I mean, you name it, they have it, right? You have tech folks. It's a pretty remarkably diverse and talented organization, but only about 1/3 of them are FBI special agents. Here's why the math matters. How many men and women in the New York City Police Department are officers, badge and a gun? Anyone know? You want to guess? Take it.
A third of them, maybe?
I'm sorry?
A third of them?
I can't hear you.
Like 25% of them?
Right, but how many? How many police officers are there in New York City? There are 13,000 FBI special agents worldwide, right? 400 offices in the U.S., 75 offices abroad, 13,000 FBI special agents worldwide. How many police officers do you have in New York City?
13,000.
About 40,000. Yeah, actually, I think the number's a little bit lower. They have some, but let's say 38,000. The FBI, the uniformed part, not uniformed, I'm sorry, the badge carrying part of the FBI, badge and gun, special agents, sworn law enforcement officers, about 1/3 the size of the New York City Police Department, which is kind of remarkable if you think about it. Because the FBI, which I guess the argument I'm trying to make, it's long-winded, circular, but bear with me, is relatively small. It's 1/3 the size of the biggest police department in the country, New York City. Well, it's another way of saying it's a finite resource. And so if a resource is finite, how do you use it? What do you do with it? How many cops are there in the United States total? About 850,000, 900,000 total, and about 18,000 different police departments. Virtually all of them, these men and women, have the capacity to do drug and gun cases, right? So, and I'm not minimizing the importance of that work. That work matters in the communities in which these folks serve, but almost every cop in America can do a gun or drug case. So at least in my small brain, it doesn't make a lot of sense to take a finite resource like the FBI, the best trained, most talented, best resourced law enforcement organization on the planet, and yeah, I'm biased, and use it in a way or to replicate work that a lot of other people are doing. So let's talk about work that the FBI does uniquely, meaning nobody else does it. Give me an example. What do you think? What's something the FBI does that nobody else does?
Interstate kidnapping or interstate...
Yeah. So it's a great example. So multi-jurisdictional stuff, right? There's a reason why a cop, let's say in St. Louis, is probably not working a case in Chicago. They don't have jurisdiction. But the FBI is not unique in the fact that they have multi-state jurisdiction. ATF has it, DEA has it, HSI has it. But yeah, that's a part of it. And by the way, historically at least, that's how the FBI kind of got started. It was car theft. First there were cars, and very shortly after you had cars, you had car theft. And cars travel across state lines, and insurance adjusters who were mostly trying to track down stolen cars in the day didn't have that sort of jurisdiction. And so you needed some organization that could work both in Missouri and Illinois. So that's absolutely a part of it. That's one of the things that gives them jurisdiction, but it doesn't make them unique. What are the things the FBI does that no one else does? Sophie, do you have it?
Domestic terrorism.
Domestic terrorism is, just
Domestic
terrorism.
terrorism.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a finite resource, you have a terrorism problem, both, Sophie, domestic and international, right? And so it makes sense that you would ask, or at least if the FBI has developed an expertise in that, you'd want to make sure you protect it. And by the way, I'm not saying, even though I am completely biased, that they are perfect. They are imperfect. Every human institution, including every institution for which each of you work, is comprised of people. People are fallible, and therefore we're imperfect. The FBI makes plenty of mistakes. They get stuff wrong. But they have really, truly, Sophie, developed an expertise in national security work, whether it's international terrorism or domestic terrorism. What else? What's that?
Embezzlement, white collar crime.
So, great point. There are other agencies that can do white collar crime. But to Michael's point, once it becomes multi-jurisdictional, or to your point, once it becomes very complex, there are fewer. When I was a line prosecutor, I used to love working with believe it or not, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. I don't know if you even heard of them, but there's a small federal law enforcement cadre there, and they're really, really, really good, including at white-collar crime. But they're tiny, and they're under-resourced. And so if you have a lead, right, on a case, let's say you're in St. Louis as an FBI agent, you need something done in Lisbon, that's easy for the FBI. That would be almost impossible for the Postal Inspection Service. So big, complicated white-collar cases, including cyber cases, healthcare fraud, insider trading, things like that. Again, the FBI, unlike the national security work, Sophie, where they really are sort of the only show in town, there are other agencies that do white-collar work, but I would submit not as well, and not at the same level of complexity. What else? There's two really important types of crime that the FBI does almost uniquely. And asking them to stop that or to shift their resources elsewhere, I think, is a grave mistake. Public corruption. That's exactly right. I would go so far to say is that almost nobody else does that. Right. And how many of you have grew up in a place where there was a lot of public corruption? A city, or, Chicago, Providence, Rhode Island, something like that. Where would you grow up? New Orleans, great example. Unfortunately.
You asked for it, Sid.
But, people sort of understand how things got done in New Orleans, right? You needed a zoning waiver approved. There's a way to get it done. There's a slow, lawful way, and there's a quick, unlawful way. And how many of you grew up in towns or communities where it didn't exist? There's obviously no one here from Vermont. But there are communities in which you really don't see public corruption. It hasn't worked its way into the community. People would be outraged. They would report it. In other places, they just sort of, hold their nose and go along with it. But the FBI does public corruption almost exclusively. And if you care about that kind of work, and I would tell you it's unbelievably hard and unbelievably important, there's really nobody else who's going to do it. What else? One more really big one. Civil rights enforcement, criminal civil rights enforcement. So even though there are only 13,000, even though they're only about a third the size of the New York City Police Department, there are certain things they do that nobody else does or nobody else does as well. And so the notion that we're going to take this cadre of men and women who I think are really the best of the best at their job, imperfect, admit that up front, but the best of the best at their job, and move them to things that 850,000 other cops could do, strikes me as insane and a misallocation of expertise and resources. Kevin, to your introduction, I'm deeply worried and by the way, it's not always the case that outsiders shouldn't come in or kick the tires or make changes. There's plenty of things I can think of at the FBI that ought to be changed and that haven't. And so having, a fresh set of eyes on it is not inherently a bad thing. But if you don't fundamentally understand what they are and what they do, then mucking around with it, I think, can be really dangerous. All right, that's my pitch. What's on your mind? I know you said you just want me to talk, but I would rather Skylar?
Yes, hi,
Okay.
Skylar Woodhouse, White House reporter with Bloomberg News. Oh,
And by the way, if I'm not making sense or something I said seems stupid or doesn't resonate, just tell me. I may not be able to fix it, but I'll try.
thanks for being here. So kind of a wordy question, but obviously, 9/11 happened and there was a lot of changes post 9/11 in terms of, you could talk about airports, how you go through security, and, the country has prided itself on avoiding another terrible event like 9/11. Sure, things have happened.
There have been a number of attempts, and there have been small, attacks that have succeeded, but nothing on that scale.
Yeah, we see things happening all the time, but given the current climate of, the country, politics, who's taking positions like Kash Patel at the FBI, how concerned are you that the U.S. could be opening itself to, some risk on the national security front on the
No, not a wordy question, Skylar. Good question. So look, there's always risk. It was never zero. Even when the FBI threw half of its workforce at the international terrorism problem post 9/11, it was never zero. They're really good at it, but they're also good at it because They work in cooperation with partners around the world, both in law enforcement and the intelligence communities. And so having credibility overseas, having partnerships overseas, having relationships overseas is part of what keeps us safe. I worry that we're really stressing that right now. However, at some level, right, in any new administration, Republican or Democrat, and I don't give a rat's ass about politics, but there is always some turmoil at the top. I think at working levels, it's going to be okay. I think the men and women who've been doing this for a long time and have been doing it together are going to continue to do what they've been doing. But are we more vulnerable when there's turmoil? Sure. Are we more vulnerable when there's a lot of noise in the system? Sure. And are we more vulnerable when really good people are either walked out the door or begin to question whether or not they should stay? Sure. So never a non-zero risk, but I think it's a riskier environment when there's turmoil. And there seems to be a good bit of that right now. Yeah.
Sorry,
Shrey. Who are you with, Shrey?
I'm with PBS NewsHour.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a little bit about, following Skylar's question about Kash Patel, Don Bongino, characters who are now tapped to lead the FBI and are leading the FBI who allegedly are leading with retribution. So are focused on targeting political enemies or people they see as political enemies. And it's a two-parter, basically. One, how detrimental is that for the agency writ large? And two...
Well, how detrimental is that for society writ large?
Society writ large, and also how detrimental is it in terms of the agency getting to focus on important work, in terms of protecting the country?
Yeah, so I sort of answered one of those, but elliptically, so let me make it more clear, Shrey. When there are lots of law enforcement officers in the country, 850,000 or so, who could do guns and drugs and gangs and stuff like that, I think it's a misapplication of finite resources to suddenly put FBI agents on immigration task forces, for instance, right? If you're getting away from the core of their work, understand that it comes at a cost. It may mean less complicated white-collar investigations. It may mean that we are, Sophie, more vulnerable to some sort of attack. There's a fine line, Shrey, right? Because you do want the outside perspective. I think there's some value in that. But I think it is more valuable when it's people who appreciate, and I'm not really answering your question, so I want you to ask it again, but I think it's more valuable when it's people who understand what the role of the FBI needs to be to keep us safe. I don't want to talk about specific leaders. I am astonished that there are people who sort of don't know, don't care to learn. I'll give you an example. I had spent my entire life in the Department of Justice. When I went to the DEA, however, I was new to it. So even though I had been a prosecutor, I'd been a U.S. attorney, I'd been at the FBI, I'd done all these things at Main Justice in the field, I still didn't know it. I didn't do anything to change it for about 12 months. I spent 12 months traveling around the country, talking to intelligence analysts, talking to diversion investigators, talking to special agents, talking to task force officers, right? Talking to every group within the DEA, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of meetings, until I began to feel like I understood what some of the problems were. It would have been idiocy for me to come in and tell them what needed to be fixed on day one. It would have been arrogant, and it would have been stupid, and it would have been wrong. And so whoever you are and whatever you're leading, whatever thing you're working on, right? I mean, the best leaders, this may sound odd, actually are incredibly humble. They know they don't know a bunch of stuff. And they shut up and they listen until they learn, because nobody learns by talking. And that's what worries me the most, right? You don't learn by talking. You learn by listening. Are there things at the FBI that need to be fixed? Absolutely. Did I know what they were at the DEA in the first year? Barely. It probably would have taken me 5 to really learn the organization, and more than that to really learn it like someone who comes up through the ranks. But the closest I could get to it, because I had to do something at some point, right, was to talk to as many people as quickly as I could and listen and try and ingest that stuff. And so I'm always worried, I'm not talking about Bongino or Patel directly, about people who think they know when they can't possibly. Yeah. Tell me your name.
Hi, Audrey with Defense One. Thanks for
Audrey.
doing this.
Okay. What's Defense One?
Defense One. I cover the DoD.
Got it.
But I'm curious about, just this whole plan to decentralize the FBI. And I know you're not inside Kash Patel's mind. You can't really tell what he's thinking. But I guess, do you have any theories on why he's doing this, the underlying motive? Like, does he not understand? Does he just actually want to dismantle the FBI?
Well, I mean, he's said a few things outside of government, Audrey, that make me wonder and worry. So let's start with this. Are there too many people at FBI headquarters? Are there too many people at the Pentagon?
Probably.
Probably. So are there too many people at FBI headquarters? Probably. Should some of them be moved to the field? Probably. Where should they go? Just to the field? So if you're going to take resources from here and move it to all these places over there, you would want to understand where the threat is, how we are aligned against the threat. What threats do you want to work, by the way? What's the threat you want to work? Because if the threat you want to work is cyber, well, the field could be anywhere. You don't have to have somebody in Pittsburgh to work a Pittsburgh cyber threat. If the threat is public corruption, maybe you want more people in New Orleans working public corruption. So you have to measure the threat, you have to understand the threat, you have to prioritize your work, and then you can realign to it. So it's not as easy as just saying, too many people at headquarters, Audrey, let's move them all to the field. That would be crazy. But I think there probably are too many people at headquarters. And so, is there a thoughtful, rational, efficient way of doing that? Absolutely, but it takes time, and you can't know it on day one. You can't know it on week one, and you can't know it on month one. So, am I for that rebalancing? Sure. We should always be looking, since we are finite with our resources, at what the threat is, how we prioritize it, and how we're going to realign to meet it. I don't know what that is. FBI has a very sophisticated prioritization matrix that they use. They sometimes call it banding, where they band each field office is asked to, within a certain articulated framework, asked to ban their threats. So where are you from, Audrey?
I'm from Annapolis, Maryland.
Okay, so in Annapolis, what's the threat in Annapolis? For instance, I would suggest there's probably a significant counterintelligence threat. The United States Naval Academy is there. I mean, you wouldn't ignore that if you were banding threats in Annapolis. Is there a violent crime threat in Annapolis? Is there a public corruption threat? It is the state capital.
It's not that bad.
Good. So it's not. So, but in other words, what I'm getting at though is you would look at the community and try and figure out, right, what are the problems in Annapolis, and then you would align your resources to that. And that means moving some people from headquarters. Let's just say in Annapolis there's no violent crime threat. It would make no sense to take people out of headquarters and put them on a violent crime task force in Annapolis, where it might make a ton of sense to take people out of headquarters and put them on a violent crime task force in Memphis or in East St. Louis. So you have to understand the threat and you have to align your resources to it. So just saying, too many people at headquarters, let's get them in the field, right? Doesn't make any sense to me at all. Yeah.
Before we go to the next question, I just wanted to follow up real quick.
Yeah.
Because I'm old enough to remember probably the biggest threat to the FBI's existence as we knew it was post 9/11.
Yeah.
When there were calls for the Bureau to be broken up.
Into an MI5, MI6 model that
Correct.
the Brits use, yeah.
And
I was on Mueller's staff at the time.
And that's
Yeah.
why I asked the question, what do you credit as sort of, we're looking at a new kind of dynamic with the FBI now, questions about how to change it or whether to change it. What did you attribute to the FBI's survival
Back then?
back then?
Yeah, Bob Mueller. And the enormous, first of all, brilliant guy, enormous credibility. Absolutely, working for him, by the way, was the professional honor of a lifetime. I tell people I would walk barefoot on broken glass for Bob Mueller. I also tell people that working for him felt like that every single day. I got in at 4:15 every morning to start my day, and left when he left around 8 o'clock, 8:30 at night. Every day. I don't mean Monday through Friday. I mean, nobody worked as hard or as much as Bob Mueller. But he didn't. He was, and as smart as he was, Princeton guy, University of Virginia Law School, knew there were things he didn't know, Kevin. He had that humility, and so he learned, right? He actually met with Eliza Manningham-Buller, who was she MI5 or MI6? Do you recall?
I don't know.
Someone could look it up real quickly, but the point being, right, he spoke with his British counterparts in law enforcement and intelligence, understood the virtues of their model and also the weaknesses of their model. What he had heard from the Brits over and over was that the FBI has it right. They have both things under the same roof. MI5 is essentially domestic intelligence in Britain. MI6, James Bond, is international intel work. The FBI does all of it. And they also have a criminal component. And what a number of the Brits told Bob was, your model actually is better than our model. It's more efficient. It's all in the same place. You can learn it here and you can action it here. You don't have to send it out. And so Mueller, I think, force of personality, intellect, all of those things, sort of learned what he needed to learn, understood it deeply, gathered tons of information, Kevin, and had the credibility on the Hill to keep it intact. Because there was a lot of interest in breaking it up. Mueller, by the way, how quaint, was confirmed 98-0. May never see that again. But truly, bipartisan support for a guy who absolutely had earned bipartisan support. Yeah, what else? Yeah, over here, and then we'll come back to Sophie. Tell me your name.
Oh, sorry. My name's Hannah Demasay. I work
Hannah.
at ABC News.
Okay.
I just wanted to talk to you or ask you questions about, intelligence sharing
Yeah.
and the importance of it. And you talk about how the chaos right now doesn't make it easy, considering, chaos kind of leads to distrust.
Yep.
And I'm curious your thoughts with the U.S. pausing, intelligence sharing or partially pausing intelligence sharing with Ukraine,
Right.
how our allies might view that, and, your concerns about, them possibly pausing or not sharing intelligence with us.
I worry about that all the time, and I worried about it when, I'll even go back further, when Mr. Trump in his first term disclosed classified information in the Oval Office to Russians. I mean, so if you're the country passing that to us, you're the country sharing that with us, might you pause before you do that again? I think so. So I worry about that all the time. But I don't mean to suggest that Mr. Trump is the only concern. Leaks are a concern. In my view, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and all those other folks are concerns. We want to talk about this too, by the way. The phrase sources and methods. What does that mean? I mean, I had a TSSCI clearance, right? So I saw lots of stuff, and sometimes I'm reading it and I'm like, why the hell is this classified? This seems so completely meaningless. And we probably do have an overclassification problem in our country. Not probably. We have an overclassification problem in our country. We also have a problem of not declassifying fully and quickly enough. Why do you think we have those two problems? They have the same root cause. What do you think it is?
People are worried about being penalized for not classifying something.
They're worried about being wrong. That's exactly right. So the bureaucratic instinct, Sophie, is I'm not going to get in trouble if I classify this thing, and I'm not going to get in trouble if I keep it classified. And it's much easier to do that than to make a decision about declassifying it or assigning a lower classification to it. And so there's a bureaucratic impulse, and I don't mean a malicious one, but an understandable one, to classify things too highly and to keep them classified too long. Okay, with that, when we talk about sources and methods, what do we mean? What is it? What does that mean? It's how we get stuff, right? How do we get stuff? There's UMINT, there's SIGINT, right? There's IMINT, human intelligence, signals intelligence, image intelligence. We have lots of ways of getting, there's OSINT, open source intelligence. There's lots of ways of getting stuff. If you're not but when I'm a consumer, Sophie, of highly classified material, I don't know if the person who classified it just did it out of bureaucratic impulse, or because the stuff is really, really, truly classified and ought to be up here. And that includes, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream?
I don't know, chocolate.
Chocolate. All right, perfectly good choice. Didn't mean to ask you such a hard question. I caught you off guard. Mine too, by the way. So let's say you lead a foreign country. You're the Prime Minister of Latvia, and I read an Intel product. This is entirely made up. I read an Intel product prior to your visit to the United States that, let's make you the leader of North Korea. Makes it more interesting. Okay. And I read an Intel product that tells me that you, the exalted leader, love chocolate ice cream. Should that be classified? Audrey says no. Why?
It's just ice cream.
But Michael says yes. Why?
Lets people know how to like curry favor with you and sort of.
All right. So you're getting, so Audrey, I disagree with you, and you're getting closer. Make an argument, Audrey, even though you don't think that Sophie's love for chocolate ice cream ought to be classified. Make an argument for why it ought to be classified. What?
Yeah.
What I do?
Why it ought to be classified?
Yeah, why it ought to be. I know you disagree, but make an argument for why it ought to be classified. Michael's getting closer. Or you can like one of those game shows. You can ask for help from the audience. You want to ask for help?
Well, I guess, I mean, along those lines, it could be looked at as a weakness.
Okay, so more like, Michael said curry favor, weakness. Leah, did you have something?
Oh, you could be poisoned?
It could be, we're not, we all like Sophie, even though we're not going to poison Sophie. But how about, no, fair enough. But how about this, Audrey? What if the only person in North Korea who knows that Sophie likes chocolate ice cream is her personal chef? What if he is a mole for the United States? What if the CIA is running him as a single source of information about the dietary habits of the leader of North Korea? What if that fact gets out that you like chocolate ice cream? How many people know that, Sophie? One. What happens to him?
Probably not something good.
Bullet in the back of the head. So sometimes by sources and methods, we're talking about how we learn something. Not necessarily what that something is. Doesn't matter if the answer is pistachio or chocolate. It matters that we know it, and we know it because we're running a highly sensitive source in a unique position to give us perhaps other information. So I don't know how the hell I got off on this tangent, but there is an overclassification problem. We do classify things too long, but there is often a very good reason why things are highly classified. What started this damn thing, Kevin? I don't even remember. All right.
Sources and methods. And
Sources, yeah, but what started that?
Hannah asked about Ukraine.
And what started that? All right. Next question. What are you all thinking about? Yeah.
let's go right down here.
Grant.
Hi.
I'm sorry. Tell me your name.
I'm Haley Bullis with the Washington Examiner.
Haley. Okay.
So you mentioned civil rights and all of that, oil of the FBI and civil liberties, enforcing that and protecting them.
Yeah.
I think it was about a week ago now, President Trump posted on two socials essentially saying, protests on college campuses should be considered illegal.
Illegal?
Yes.
Okay. Must have missed that one.
there's been a lot. Don't blame you. But do you have any concerns about, how the FBI might be utilized in these protest cases or incidents?
Well, so the original concerns, it's a finite resource with a workforce trained to do things that are really important and unique to them. So, zero-sum game, right? Hell, you start doing X, that may mean you're not doing Y. But I look, right, I mean, if you look at the domestic investigations operations guidelines for the FBI, it's this big, thick book. They are, again, not perfectly so. Every human institution is fallible and flawed in some way. But they're really, really, really good at being really, really, really careful about First Amendment implications of their work. So I would be worried generally, not just about the FBI, if that became a focus of law enforcement activity, right? What people say, how they say it, where they say it, why they say it. I think that's a perilous path for a democracy. So I think it's broader than an FBI issue. I didn't see what he said. I don't know of anything afoot to actually, do that. I mean, universities, whatever the kids are saying, ought to be, as long as you're not inciting a riot or something like that, ought to be places where people can speak freely. I teach at Georgetown. I teach national security law and policy. I actually don't teach in the law school. I teach undergraduate. And you may be surprised, but I have a lot of divergent views in my classroom, which I think is absolutely awesome. And I want to make it a place where people can say what they think or ask dumb questions. Actually, very few of the questions are dumb. These are pretty smart kids. I would hate if somebody were sitting in the back of the classroom monitoring what those kids were saying. That would, just as like I would hate if anyone were telling you what you could or could not write. So that is a perilous path. Yeah. Grant, and then we'll come here to, is it Sibel? Okay.
Hey, Grant Schwab with the Detroit News, but I'm based here in Washington.
Okay. How big is there Washington?
It used to be a lot bigger.
It's Grant.
It's two.
Okay.
Myself and a bureau chief.
Okay.
30 years ago, it was like 12, 15 people.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Anywho, here we are.
Yeah.
You said you feel that despite kind of the turmoil at the top of the bureau, that kind of the working levels will be okay.
I do believe that, Grant. I could also be wrong, but I do believe that.
Well, why do you believe that? Do you have a relationship still with people in the bureau who tell you, hey, things look okay for us?
Two things. One is I'm old and I've been around for a while, and I understand, I think, the nature of these institutions. Those values are pretty deeply rooted. I don't think it's impossible to undo that. I think it's very, very difficult to undo that. And I do talk to people in U.S. attorneys' offices and FBI offices who, for the most part, whatever the noise up here may be, Grant, they're just doing their work. Now, I will also say this. I've lived through enough changes in administration. So this Attorney General comes in and he wants to do Project Safe Childhood. And this Attorney General comes in and she wants to do Project Safe Neighborhood. And there's a bank fraud task force, and there's a savings and loan crisis, and there's a healthcare fraud effort. And so there's always some of that change. There's always some shift. By and large, the work looks the same in Detroit. And it will look the same 10 years from now as it did 10 years ago. But the first conversation I had with Sophie, I do worry if the FBI starts doing things that everyone else can do and isn't doing things that nobody else can do. So, Sibel? Yeah. Wait, I think they want you to have a microphone. Yeah.
So, I'm Sibel with USA Today. Hi.
Kevin's old shop.
Yeah. So I think what I'm wondering is just, I'm sure there will be people in the FBI, even if they're not at the lower levels, who if we start to see people in the FBI who are getting orders where they're questioning like the legality of this, or people starting to feel from within the organization like they're getting like improper directives and stuff like this, as reporters, like how can we keep on the pulse of that and be like a safe place for those people to come out and be able to talk and blow the whistle in a way that wouldn't compromise them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't know that most agents or most prosecutors will ever talk to you. And I would tell you that when I was there, I would never talk to you. And so those who do, I'm not saying they're wrong, but as always, you should be circumspect. There's a small number that come forward, and a smaller number of those who are sort of knowledgeable, thoughtful, and accurate. When you start to, but I've also, because I read a bunch of papers every day, and even the very best get a bunch of stuff wrong. They're reporting it accurately, but it's not accurate. Does that make sense? That's a hard question to answer. I mean, you got to do what we do in investigations. You got to talk to as many people as you can. You got to circle the problem over and over and over again. And you got to get people who wouldn't ordinarily talk to you. The agent in Detroit who thinks she knows what the problem is but has never been to headquarters or has never been to another field office may not have the entire story, or she may. And it's hard for you to know that because you are truly an outsider to that organization. And so, I always felt when I was conducting investigations, I was a pain in the ass because I wanted to talk to everyone and know everything. And there is a diminishing marginal return, and at some point you have to write your story. And I get that. But sometimes tapping on the brakes, slowing down, and talking to an extra person, I think is good practice. By the way, I think this is really cool. You guys and I, we're like, there may be some other, but it's the only two lines of work I know of where we have to, where we routinely admit we get stuff wrong publicly. I mean, it's really cool. I have an absolute obligation as a prosecutor to go into court and tell a judge I screwed up. Absolute obligation. And I took it seriously, and I did it, any number of times. Your Honor, yesterday I said X. It turns out that it's not X, it's Y. Either I'll do better next time, or here's why I got it wrong. You guys do that every day, right? I mean, it's an amazing thing, if you think about it, to publish your mistakes, either in court or, in a newspaper. We will never avoid that, but by tapping on the brakes and talking to more people and slowing down a little bit, you can minimize it. You also have a different pressure than I did as a prosecutor. If I had somebody on the streets who was hurting people, then I had to move really fast. But if I'm doing a big white-collar investigation like we had talked about, Shrey, I have more time. People may lose money, but no one's going to die. You guys are always under pressure to publish, I think. I mean, how many of you are sort of permitted to work on long-form thought pieces? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3 and a half. Okay, where do you work?
I work at National Journal, but I also do write newsletters every weekday.
Okay, so you have both?
Yeah.
And you get to do both?
Yeah, if I'm lucky.
If you're lucky, but not ordinarily.
Yeah.
And you get to do both at Christian Science Monitor. But most of you didn't raise your hand, meaning most of you are under pressure to get it out yesterday. And certainly, CNN before MSNBC, damn them, gets to it, right, Michael? And so you have a countervailing pressure. And I think it can lead to bad journalism. By the way, this will sound like I'm sucking up to you guys. I'm not. I am incredibly grateful that you all have chosen this path of you get paid less than you would anywhere else, to work harder than you would anywhere else, and to get yelled at more than you would anywhere else. In a time when our institutions are faltering, Congress is completely feckless, and that's not new. I don't mean to suggest that if you're covering it, they're not a good story. I mean, car crashes tend to make good stories, and Congress is one long car crash. And the executive branch is changing in ways that are unfamiliar to most people. There's only two things left. I actually believe there are two things left. The courts and you. And so I am unbelievably grateful that you are doing what you're doing, because it's really, really hard, and the environment in which you're doing it is more difficult now than I think it ever has been. Is that fair, Kevin?
I think it's more than fair.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a time when an administration would call out the press in a way that it has.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, yes, but even beyond that, right? I mean, Faith, you look at Gallup polling
Sure.
or polling
Public
about
trust.
public trust in institutions, not just the media. I mean, Congress is now an asterisk. They don't even rate a 1 or a 2 in public approval ratings. They're an asterisk. But public approval, public confidence in academia, in big business, in religion, in law enforcement, in the courts, everything is cratering. And it may have dissuaded some people from doing the kind of work that you guys are doing. I get that. But I am unbelievably grateful that you're doing it. It is more important now than ever. Like I said, I think we have two institutions left. You guys and the courts. And I'm worried about the courts. What else?
A question. Who's got another question? I don't want to interfere. Okay, let's go over here first.
Stephanie?
And I'll save mine.
How much time do we have?
Just a few more.
All right. What time is it, Sibel?
12:15.
All right. What do you guys have after this? Lunch. Am I what's standing between you and lunch? Oh, God. I am so sorry.
Thank you so much. Stephanie Lai with Bloomberg News. I guess my question is sort of related to the methods that FBI agents use. I know that in the last couple of years there's been a lot of pushback on, just federal law enforcement in general, how they treat people. And I'm just curious.
Go ahead.
I'm curious, where that stands nowadays with the FBI.
Well, it's a broad question. How do they treat people?
I guess in terms of treatment of people that they're arresting, and then just in general, all the pushback that we'd seen in 2020 with the George Floyd protests.
Right, but those. So
is it, I guess the
Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. Let's be clear about what happened. That wasn't a lawful arrest. That wasn't a lawful detention. It was a crime. But that wasn't the FBI.
Right, but my question is, has that translated at all to the FBI in terms of how, methods of treating people that are...
Yeah, no, look, I mean, my experience, and I can only talk to mine, Stephanie, is that, they are extremely professional. Again, human institution, some people are flawed. Are some people at the FBI flawed? Absolutely. But I think overall, the ethos is very professional, high level of responsibility, high level of training. But every time, and this is why I wrote my letter to my entire workforce after President Trump made those comments about cops roughing up people in their custody, right? We spend our entire career trying to build bridges to the communities that we serve. And your question captures it perfectly. Something awful happens, and let's be clear, what happened to George Floyd was awful. It was a crime. It was a murder. And then someone will say, law enforcement sucks. Look at the way they treated George Floyd. All right. Let's do some math. I said before there were about 850, 900,000 men and women in law enforcement. What percentage of those men and women do you think suck at their job? They're dishonest, they're corrupt, they're in for the wrong reason, they're evil, they're violent, they're looking to hurt people. Tell me what percentage you think that describes. I mean, you would all agree with me that some percent are in for the right reason. Right? They care deeply about their communities. They want to serve. They're passionate about that. They're kind. They're thoughtful. They're honest. Right? That's a non-zero number, right, Stephanie? All right. What percentage do you think are in for absolutely the wrong reasons? Just give me a number. 10%? 5%? 2%? I'm talking about the worst. I'm not talking about lazy. I'm talking about violent and corrupt. What percent? All right, I'll pick a number. let's just say, I'm just making this up, 5%. If there are 800,000 cops in America, then 40,000 of them, 5%, would be the worst of the worst of the worst. What are the odds that one of those people is going to do something like Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd? Relatively high. If you have 40,000 people running around somewhere in the country. Most people would say in your line of work, are 95% of the reporters really hard working, really thoughtful, are they? Do you have that percentage? Not a chance. But I would also suggest that you don't have a 10% corruption rate. You might have people who aren't very good, who aren't very industrious, who aren't very smart, but 10% of them aren't corrupt. If the number of people in law enforcement, again, I'm just making up the number, Stephanie, is only 5%, that's 40,000 cops capable of doing what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd. And so every time something like that happens, it's what? Ascribed to the broader community. Fair or unfair? I think the answer is both. How do you solve that problem? It's a really hard problem to solve. So, does it make sense that people would lose faith in the church if there's a corruption scandal, or faith in the courts if a judge turns out to be taking money on the side, or faith in law enforcement if there's a Derek Chauvin out on the streets? Sure, because that's what we're seeing and hearing. It doesn't describe the majority of people in that industry, far from it, but it's an enormous problem. That's why I wrote my letter. Because I think any good cop, any good FBI agent would tell you that undoes so much of the work we're trying to do. Just as it must make you sick, right? I forget her name, it was some number of years ago, but the Washington Post reporter who was making up her stories. Janet Cook. I mean, if you're a journalist who cares passionately about your trade, about your work, and somebody does that to you, and suddenly none of us believe what you write or what you say, how do you feel, Stephanie? Right. Same problem. Time for another question and then lunch? What's for lunch, by the way?
Tacos, if you're interested.
Yeah, it could be.
Not seeing any.
There's.
Yep, yeah. Pass down.
Hi, but going back to the letter that you wrote it and then you said you were removed shortly after.
I was given the option to transfer to some, sort of that sanctuary city enforcement team option that you saw some of the senior people at DOJ getting. It was not unlike that.
Right.
So I resigned in lieu of being fired.
Okay.
Or in lieu of being transferred. I'm not sure what the hell happened to me, but.
Obviously, you said you stand by writing that letter.
100%.
What was the response you got from, the people that work with you every day, and when you sent that letter out, and then,
I heard from people all over the country and all levels of law enforcement saying thank you. Mm-hmm. I also worried deeply because the last thing, you don't want to make this about you, right? And you don't want to drag your people and your organization into some fight that they didn't pick. So I understand why a lot of people said nothing. But I think saying nothing sometimes is the road to hell. And so I can't tell you that I lightly wrote that email. When you hit send on an email to 11,000 people, one of you guys is going to get that in milliseconds. In this case, it was the New York Times. They wrote a very nice editorial about me. That was the end of me. So you don't do those things lightly, just as when we were talking about people who come forward, right? You have to be circumspect, you have to question motives, you have to circle the problem, you have to talk to lots of people. But I think silence is the road to hell in that situation. Silence is assent. And to Stephanie's question, right? I mean, that's the thing that troubles me the most. If we stand by and we say nothing, then it's tacit approval. And sometimes that's just unacceptable. Not everything is a fight. And there were plenty of policy decisions during my time in the Department of Justice, things we vehemently disagreed about, raised voices behind closed doors. Happens all the time. And sometimes you're on the short end of those, and sometimes you're on the long end of those. Doesn't matter. That's not about ethics or morality or those are usually about strategy or tactics. And you lose some of those and you move on. You know, you only get to resign once. Or you only get to send an email like that once. And so you have to really be careful about picking your battles and not just do it because you disagree. I mean, have any of you already lost editorial fights? Have you resigned? Would you? Is it conceivable you would? Is there some matter that where your editor says, do X, and you say, I'm out of here? I mean, that's happening in newsrooms right now, isn't it? Doesn't that happen? Who's at the Post? It is. Yeah. It's happening right now. So, I would just say you're going to have lots of arguments in your professional careers. Arguments are healthy if they're done in the right way. I don't urge you to resign because you disagree about an editorial judgment, but it's sort of the Potter Stewart definition of pornography from the 1963 case. I forget what, but you know it when you see it, right? And there may come a time in your professional life when you see it and you know it's wrong and you walk out the door. That's okay too. All right, go get lunch.
Thanks, Chuck. Thank you very much.